So hello everybody and welcome to this evening's webinar. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Justin Howard-Sneyd, Master of Wine, who, if I tried to give a comprehensive introduction to, it would take most of the rest of the webinar. But Justin joins us today in his capacity as a trustee of the Regenerative Viticulture Foundation, which I think he'll tell you a little bit about later on, to cover this topic on regenerative viticulture. So Justin, if you're ready to go, I'll hand you over the reins and I'll pop back up at the end to host the Q&A. So Justin, it's all yours.
Great. Justin, thank you very much. And lovely to see you all. And thanks very much for inviting me to come and talk about this subject, which I'm very motivated and interested in. I've got a lot of slides to show you with quite a lot of technical stuff. Most of the slides are going to be available to you afterwards, so make notes as you go by all means, but hopefully for many of them you should be able to have the slide. There's a few that I've been kindly offered to use in education, but I don't have the copyright to show them to you in a shareable form after the seminar, so those won't be available. But most of the rest of the slides will. Just before we start, I'm sitting here, you might think I'm sitting in a lovely, beautiful vineyard in the south of France. Actually, I'm not. I'm in my office in London. But behind me is one of the vineyards of Domaine of the Bee, which is my small Roussillon property. We make about 15 to 20,000 bottles of wine a year on, well, 4 hectares of vines for red wine, and then the white and the pink are sourced from my friend Jean-Marc. We are only in the foothills of thinking about how to become more regenerative. And I think it's probably quite a good place to start, just to sort of share with you my journey in learning what regenerative viticulture is. My immersion in this has been fairly recent, probably just over 3 years ago. I started working with the Dartington estate in Devon, who run all sorts of courses. We thought it would be a very topical subject because they're very, very into regenerative farming and regenerative culture. To try and run something on regenerative viticulture, about which I did not know a great deal at the time. So I did a lot of podcast listening, a lot of learning, a lot of talking to people, and was really getting up to speed in what that actually meant in vines when Stephen Cronk, who founded the Regenerative Viticulture Foundation, asked me to come on board, not because of my deep regenerative knowledge, which wasn't deep by that stage, but because of my connections in the world of wine and ability to raise funds for the charity. So I'm now a trustee of the charity, have been for a couple of years, and spend quite a lot of my time learning about and advocating for regen as a concept. So I'm going to talk you through really an introduction. I'm sort of assuming you all know which way up the vine goes in the ground, and you've got some basics of viticulture understanding, but I'm not going to assume a great deal of knowledge, and I'm just going to try and show you what regenerative is and how it differs from other forms of viticulture. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, which if I get the right one should be this one here. So I hope you can now see a slide that says Introduction to Regenerative Viticulture. And let's crack on. So I guess these slides are pulled together from a variety of different presentations that I've been giving in the last 6 months or so. I did speak at the MW Symposium in Germany last summer, and I was also teaching MW students in Australia in January. So a few slides have come from there, and a few have come from my teachings at Dartington and other events that I've been speaking at. So what we will find is that there's quite a few different slides and different formats. But I think the first question to ask is, does viticulture actually have a problem? I think most people think viticulture is quite a nice way of using land and quite benevolent. But actually, is it? And is it sustainable? Can you keep on doing it for the next several hundred years without having to change what you do? Are you exploiting anything or anybody? Are you depleting your soil? And modern viticulture has changed quite a lot. And, it's more efficient. There's more yield, perhaps better quality than there was 100 years ago. Certainly more mechanized, less labor. Lots of things are good that we've changed in the last 100 years, but actually quite a lot of things are bad as well. I'm just going to flip to this slide, which was drawn by a Kiwi cartoonist just during the COVID crisis. And we were all worried about COVID, and then obviously lurking behind COVID was a horrible recession. And behind the recession, obviously, we talk a lot about climate change. Climate change is very real and very much with us and very much affecting us in the Roussillon at the moment because it's incredibly dry. But for my money, climate change is just a symptom of the wider problem, which is humans' impact on the planet and the biodiversity collapse that we're causing, and the habitat loss, and there are myriad reasons why our presence on this planet needs to urgently change the way it behaves, and farmland is quite important in that. So let's just have a recap of how we use land on our little planet. Only 29% of the surface is actually land. 71% of that is deemed habitable. This is data from Our World in Data. Of the habitable land, 50% is agricultural. Lots of that is forest and shrub. And of the agricultural land, the vast majority is livestock, meat and dairy, 23% is crops, and that's 11 million square kilometres, or 1.1 billion hectares. So quite a lot of agricultural land. How much does viticulture take up? So of 1.1 billion, about 7.3 million hectares. So that is somewhere less than 1% of agricultural land is viticultural land. And that's the land within the control of people in the wine world. And it's our job, I guess, to look after that land. Just skipping to France, that actually is about 3% of agricultural land in France, because viticulture is obviously a very important phenomenon in France. But that sector generates 15% of the entire revenue, which really, as you can see, punches above its weight. It's a valuable crop. It doesn't just deliver financial return, it delivers in the conversation. It's quite important economically. We don't have a lot of conferences of people talking about carrot growing or wheat growing, but we do talk a lot and fly around the world to talk about wine. So, of the ways of farming grapes, I was thinking to the MW students in Adelaide that actually 20 years ago, most people would be talking about viticulture in an MW essay, just thinking about what makes the best quality. But actually, the people, profit, and planet sort of trifecta is pretty important, and companies generally have been focusing on producing profit for their shareholders, and sometimes forgetting about people who work for them or their customers, and forgetting about the planet. And triple bottom line reporting, which is becoming more and more important, and carbon credits and all these things are ways of trying to get us to measure how we impact people and how we impact the planet better than we have been. So viticulture, what is best is a complicated question, but I think we've got to be considering the planet as a very important part of that. And current viticulture is not superbly sustainable. I'm just going to skip to a quote that Claude Bourguignon gave in Burgundy. He was visiting Burgundy in the 90s, 1992, I think it was. And he'd done some soil analysis, and he was horrified how poor the soils that there were. And he stood up in a conference and he said he has seen more soil life in the sands of the Sahara than he has in the vineyards of Burgundy. And that perhaps is an indication of how viticulture generally, but also recent viticultural practices, have depleted soil. So regenerative agriculture, and I'll talk a little bit about the term and its relationship to agriculture as we go on, is a term that really refers to what is an overarching philosophy. It is science-led. It isn't new. Lots of the things that regenerative advocates are things that have been done by different peoples in different parts of the world, but it's kind of bringing them together and proving why they work in certain environments that perhaps is new. The intentional philosophy is to try and work with nature rather than against it, trying to understand what the forces of life are wanting to do in a particular piece of land and trying to encourage them to do what supports what you're trying to do, rather than trying to fight against it all the time. In my money, it overcomes many of the objections to organics and biodynamics. And those objections are probably that mostly there, well, certainly on organics side, it's a list of things you can't do. And it's all, both organics and biodynamics, it's a little bit like tablets of stone that have been handed down, and this is how you have to do it. And there's no evolution or change in the prescriptions of what you are told to do. And that, I think, is one of the obstacles to that, because clearly, as we learn more in different environments, you need to adapt what you've been told, and those adaptations are kind of not really allowed. If you want to be certified, you have to follow the practices. And I think regenerative is also a wonderful philosophy that allows you to start from where you are and not some mythical future. Start from where you are and do what you can to make a change in the right direction. So all those attributes, I think, really are well applied to regen as a concept. There's a guy called Robert Rodale who formed the Rodale Institute in the States, who's an early advocate of organic and sustainable farming. He was problematic. He thought the word sustainable was problematic because we believe that we're sustaining something that's adequate, and actually what we're doing at the moment isn't adequate. and therefore trying to sustain things isn't the right thing to think about. Actually, trying to regenerate and give life back, build life back into the soil is what we need to be thinking about. This is a slide from Groundswell, which is one of the it's the main UK regenerative farming festival. It's sometimes been called the Glastonbury of farming. It's in June, and it's it's good fun 2-day sitting in a field, listening to farmers talking, and actually an amazingly large number of interesting people, writers and broadcasters and politicians gathering in a field to talk about how we use our land. And the essential thinking behind regenerative farming is 5 principles they've got here from the Groundswell. Is first of all, integrating livestock into your cycle. And obviously this is for broadleaf agriculture, but that agriculture with no livestock is missing some very important components. So livestock integration is an important part of regen. And interesting question how we apply that in vineyards. We'll come to that later. But then minimizing soil disturbance. No-till, you've probably heard of no-till. That's a very important principle. We'll talk a bit about why disturbing the soil is a bad thing to do. Covering the soil surface, either with a mulch or with living plants at all times, or as all times as possible. Maintain living roots in the soil. So you always have a living creature growing in the soil. And as much diversity as possible in your crops, in your rotation, in your margins, in the other plants you allow to grow in your field and things around the field, having as much diversity as possible. Those are important principles. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Some other terms you may have come across: agroecology, permaculture, regen, whole farm systems, agroforestry. They're all attempting to use ecological processes to regenerate, maintain, and build natural resources for the future. That's a good sort of summary of what those, and they all have slightly different emphases and different histories, those terms, but they're all related and they all form part of a picture. Where did the word regenerative come from? I think the history goes back to the Dust Bowl in the States in the 20s and early 30s, when agriculture became so intensive and so much ploughing was done that effectively the organic matter disappeared, the roots in the soil disappeared, and what was left was just dust. And then in a few dry years, that just blew away, and there was no organic life in the soil and no possibility of growing any crops. And actually, the USDA formed I think the FSA, it was called, the Farm Service Agency. And one of the things they just determined was it's really important to leave something growing in the ground all the time. So when you take out your crop, immediately plant something else and get that growing quickly to stabilize the soil. And this idea of no-till farming started really perhaps in that part of the country. And it's been given the term regenerative as the major way of trying to refer to it. No-till or regen farming has become a big thing. If you want to watch a very good kind of consumer film that introduces the concepts of what regen is about, there's 2 really good ones that I've certainly seen and enjoyed. Kiss the Ground, which is narrated by Woody Harrelson. It's a documentary, but it's really very well filmed and quite instructive and quite important. And then one called The Biggest Little Farm, which is a couple, one of whom was a documentary filmmaker who decided to change their lives and buy a farm in the hills in California. And they bought an old, rather depleted orchard and turned it into a wonderful regenerative farm with a few dangers and problems along the way. But it is very engaging, and you can feel when you see what practices they're putting in place. You know, it sort of makes sense in a way that all sorts of charts and slides and photographs don't make sense. When you sort of tell the story about how the land went from what it was to what it became, you can understand it in a much more visual and sort of emotional way than just someone telling you it's a good idea. I would encourage you to watch those 2 films, just with your families as well. They're interesting films, so anyone would be interested to watch them. They're not just for geeky wine folk. One of the other things to think about is a lot of our human activity, and this is the problem of the Anthropocene and humans' impact on the world, is what's known as extractive versus circular. So if what you're doing is taking something out of the ground and making it into something, selling it to someone, then it's used and thrown away and not reused. You basically extracted something out of the earth. And clearly that can't continue because there's a limit to what is present in the surface of the earth, and minerals and rare metals and that kind of thing. We just need to get to a place where we're recycling a lot more. And those principles also apply to the carbon cycle and the water cycle and various other ecological principles, that kind of foundation of understanding regen. So just think about how much are you being exploitative. If you plant a vineyard and then when it's 50 years old, it gets ripped out, and then you can't really replant it without regenerating the soil. I mean, how can you keep that vineyard living for hundreds of years, or continually producing that on that plot of land successfully for hundreds of years? Let's just skip along to what might be a sort of textbook look at the various ways of farming grapes. And I think there's a few flaws to this model, but the idea is, that it's a pyramid, and at the bottom is conventional farming, and then people who've achieved some form of sustainability accreditation, some of which are not terribly difficult, but they're definitely a step forward from just being a conventional farmer who doesn't care. Excuse me. And up from there, we might think that organic is therefore better, and then biodynamics at the top of the pyramid. So slightly false model in our view. What I think, and it's also worth remembering, biodynamic is way less than 1% of vineyards. I think we worked out that organic is just hit over 6% worldwide. It may be higher than that now, but from the numbers we were last looking at. Very hard to say what percentage of vineyards are sustainable. First of all, it's really difficult to define what that means. I think we're estimating, if you're subscribed to a sustainability scheme in your country, and we believe that 96 or 97% of all vineyards in New Zealand are sustainable according to the New Zealand system, and in South Africa quite a lot, and in France there's HVE, and there's a lot of different certifications. It's very hard to keep track of them, but it's still probably less than 20% of vineyards have signed up to those. So the vast majority of people are conventional. And our view would be that if you're looking at soil health as being your major metric of success, that everyone, each one of those types of farming, can improve their soil health. And you may still have them in that order, that the conventional farmer is at the bottom. But equally, if you can be organic, but if your principal method of weed control is ploughing, and your principal method of fungal control is copper, you can have very, very unhealthy soil. And actually, a sustainable farmer or a conventional farmer can have much healthier soil than you, even though you're organic. And organic is a good system. There's lots of great people growing grapes organically, but there is a sort of tendency towards the industrialization of organics on a huge scale, where you just do the following and it's classified as organic, and it doesn't necessarily mean the soil is particularly healthy. So I think the way we think is rather more complicated, that wherever you are, you can deplete your soil or you can improve your soil considerably under whatever system you're using, and that we'd like to see more people improving the quality of their soil and building back in diversity and soil health. So lots to learn about what soil is about, and we're not going to go too much into that in this conversation. There's loads to learn, and we'll talk a little bit about it in a little minute. But there's a great thing in a site in a website from New Zealand, Land Care Research, and I think this is a really good description of how people who think regeneratively approach things. So it's hard to know where to start on the circle, but let's say here a little bit what I said. Plan for what you want, but start from what you have. So that's thinking about really understanding your own land and what is there, and then try and work out what it is you want to do, and then work out how to get there. So it's a very pragmatic way of looking at things. Principle of maximizing photosynthesis, and let's just recap the fact that all the energy on this planet that drives everything living on the planet is coming from the sun, and everything, all the fossil fuel we burn, is past photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is the driver of life, and the plant, whatever plant it is that's growing in your soil, is photosynthesizing sunlight and pumping out exudate from its roots to feed the soil life. So there's absolutely loads of things in the soil. I'll show you a little picture in a minute, that live in the soil, that do their jobs in the soil, that eat each other, defecate, decompose, and cause this incredibly complicated system of life in the soil. But it comes from photosynthesis. So having photosynthesizing plants in your soil is really important for soil life. When you see a vineyard that is devoid of anything green except for a vine, and I'm now looking at my vineyard at the back, and what you can see right in front of me is the tractor row, which is in the Roussillon, in a dry country, and in lots of dry areas, pretty dry in the summer. It can be quite a lot greener in the winter, but we are finding it difficult to practice living roots in the soil in our place in the Roussillon, as lots of people in hot countries are. Next thing is minimize disturbance of the soil. We'll talk a bit about that in a while. Apologies if you can hear my Labrador barking. He's something's come to the door, I think. Harness the diversity in your vineyard. Again, we'll talk a little bit about that later. Manage livestock strategically or holistically. And this is really an instruction for farmers, non-vineyards, because there aren't many vineyards that have their own herds. It's quite a good thought as to how you do introduce livestock if you don't have a herd. I know there are some vineyards that do, like Taplas Creek, who've got their own herd of sheep. But the idea here is to use the livestock for what they do for your land as much as you're growing them for wool or growing them for meat. You're actually also improving your land by using them and rotating them around. So that's part of that thinking. The toolbox you've got in Regen is flexible and open to new things, new tech. It's not a closed book, so you can use anything that sort of achieves the end. Failing is part of the journey, and you learn better by failing, because then you know what not to do it again. You can tell people what happened. Learning together in groups is really important, and that's the best way of sharing this knowledge, is having people share what happened to them and what they did. And there's some great things to read and learn about if you want to go down there. I can give you a reading list, Justin. I haven't got this on this presentation, but if anyone's interested, I can suggest a few books to read. Question everything. Remember that the farm is a living system. The whole farm, under the ground and above the ground, is all interconnected and alive. And make your decisions based on your specific context. Don't just read what someone has done in a different country and try and do it. You've got to understand your own land. So I think those are really interesting priorities and an interesting way to think about things. Here's a picture of a photosynthesizing plant. Also, you've got prunings and leaf litter and things that blow into. You've got compost, mulch, and biochar potentially if you're adding things to the soil. They all go into making up soil organic matter. A very important percentage of what happens in soil is organic matter. It can range from nearly nothing, 0.5%, up to 10% in some land. Most vineyard land is relatively poor, 1 to 4%, probably typical. But improving your soil organic matter is almost always a good thing to do. And then that organic matter is doing all sorts of things. Microbial biomass is decomposing, and then it locks the carbon up in some inorganic carbon that stays stable in the soil, and this organic carbon that's much more prone to be metabolized and respired back to the atmosphere. Yeah, this is a picture of a few things that are important to think about. I'm sorry about my Labrador. I don't know what to do about him. I'm just going to shut the door just in case that makes things a bit better. He's now going to scratch on the door in a little while. Top left, you can see roots that have been exuding carbon, and then they've attracted creatures that stick to the outside of the root. So there's lots of soil stuck to the glomulin, which is one of the chemicals that a root produces. And that's a sign of a really active, healthy soil. And you can pull a root out, and there's lots of little rhizo sheaths, they're called. On the bottom left, you see nodules. You're probably familiar with nitrogen fixing. You don't need to apply nitrate fertilizer derived from the Haber-Bosch process. You can grow plants in your soil that fix nitrogen for you. And incorporating that in your cover crop, you can see Stephen Cronk in his Provence vineyard here. I think on the left here, you've got some legumes in this row and grasses in this row. So rotating your cover crops and applying useful things to grow is very important. Lots of compost, bottom right here. Animals in the vineyard, and then you've got biodiversity and wildlife all around as a result of your practices. So that's a nice picture of what a regenerative vineyard might look like. Now, I'm just going to show you this slide. So the next few slides come from a wonderful French regen specialist called Frédéric Thomas. He's an agriculturalist, but he has vineyard clients in France. And I had a fantastic session with him, thought he was really interesting. So he showed this slide and he said, in which container has the soil been heat treated? And that effectively means heated up to the extent where it kills everything in the soil. And so you look at those two, and obviously I can't get any feedback or ask you any questions. I can't see if you're putting them in the answers in the Q&A, but I'm going to take it that you're probably thinking, well, the one on the right looks a bit healthy. So let's say that one, no, let's say the other one's been heat treated, and the one on the left. It's actually the one on the right has been heat treated. what that does, what heat treating does, is it kills the organic life in the soil. What that then starts to do is decompose. And as it decomposes, it liberates all of the nitrogen and the nutrients that are locked up inside those organisms in the soil, liberates them for the plant. The plant suddenly goes, hey, hey, I've got some nitrogen, starts growing really healthily. And this is a bit much the reason why lots of growers, particularly in Europe, particularly in France, will say it's very important to work the soil. So working the soil gives me this boost of fertility. So when you plough the soil, what you're doing is you're turning it over. You're inverting soil that was 9 inches or a foot under the soil. You're bringing it up to the surface. You're taking stuff that's got plant roots in it and you're burying it so that the plants die and can't grow. And almost every creature that's got a little niche inside the soil, the complex society that's living in the soil, can no longer do what it was doing because it either wants air and now hasn't got any, or it doesn't like air and now is exposed to too much and solar radiation. Basically, things die and then they release their nutrients into the soil. So the plants get a little boost. But Fredericks is a bit like having a champagne bottle in the fridge. You shake it up and then you put the cork back in, you stick it in the fridge, and then you take it out next year and you shake it up again, and then you put it back in. And the more you shake it up, the more CO2 is liberated from the champagne, and in this case, the more carbon is liberated from the soil until there just isn't any left. You end up with soil that has no carbon left in it and is effectively dead. So that is the effect of ploughing and ploughing over and over again without incorporating other things to bring fertility back into your vineyard. Here's a really good slide that shows you what happens when you do that. So on the left-hand scale, vertical axis, the microbial activity, and on the bottom scale, you've got the months. And the line with a bit of green in it, travail simplifié, is where the soil isn't really worked at all. It's just maybe a very light scratching to perhaps control some weeds, but that's all that's been done. The line without the green, the spiky one, is when you labor, when you work the soil effectively by ploughing. So when you do the ploughing, you get this massive spike in microbial activity because of this die-off, and everything decomposes and starts to liberate its nutrients, and then a much, much lower level of microbial activity because you depleted the microbes in the soil. So that's a sort of scientific way of showing you what's happening in the soil when you do plough. And it's really important that you actually keep the soil in the field. So if you don't have living roots in the soil, again, these are some of Frederick's slides, so just showing examples of where soil has washed away. And here you have a river estuary where it's coming out completely brown. Small wine quiz for you. Some of you might recognize that bridge. Just leave you to think about it for a little while. Makes red and white wine. It's in Bordeaux. It's on the Gironde. I think that's taken from the Cité du Vin museum. But the Gironde is always brown. It's actually not really the vineyards that cause the problem further up. There's lots of agriculture further upstream, and there's just always soil washing into the river. And it hasn't always been like that. It's the human activity that has caused that to a large extent. Just keeping an eye on the time. We're doing fine. This is a graph that talks about the impact of working the land on the soil temperature. So when you work the land and expose it and make it completely bare, the black line is the daily cycle of heat and coolness in the nighttime. The same land or that land nearby that you just do very superficial work on is the blue line. And when you just disc the soil, which means just sliding a disc into it to cut the roots, but not really turning it over or disturbing it at all, you get the red line. So much, much less temperature variation. So on a hot day, the soil gets less hot. Here is a picture of, again, on the same day, adjacent bits of land with different amounts of cover on them, and this is the temperature that they achieve. So 40 on the barest land, 29 on some land that's got a little bit of greenery, right down below 20, 19.7 with absolutely loads of green and shade, and you can imagine putting your hand on there and it feeling cooler. And actually, almost coolest of all is where you've got a vegetal cover. It's like a mulch of destroyed crops, of hay that's been cut and left to lie as a mulch. That can keep the soil really cool as well. So keeping your soil surface temperature cool is really important. It stops your water evaporating and actually helps you retain moisture. Again, here's some picture which has got a comparison of when you've got bare soil. So on the left-hand side, the two columns, interrang is between the rows and intercept is in the undervine strip. of the temperature on a really hot day. I think the day was 37 degrees, and the inter-row temperature was 42 degrees on the soil and 37 under the vines. When you have a cover crop that you cut on the 10th of May, you can see that's reduced. So this is done in August. So the 10th of May cover crop's getting quite old now, but it's been lying on the ground in a mulch. It really does reduce the temperature considerably, and actually the most recently cut cover crop reduces it even further. Well, certainly on the interrow. So you can see the effect you can have of manipulating the soil temperature by using plant cover. This is a drone footage of a piece of land where the temperature varies from 47 and 29, depending on what's growing on there, which is pretty astonishing. And you could go into a street in a city and point a temperature gun at various different things. And in a place with no trees, in the 40s, in a place with shade and trees in the 20s, it's a big difference. And we all know when we go to a city with lovely trees in it, that it'll feel cool under the trees, and they are actually cooling the atmosphere through shading and also transpiring. So in vineyards, lots of cover crops planted. One of Frederick's mantras is, sorry, let's go back. Let's not just have single varietal mixes. Red clover or the yellow stuff is that fescue or ryegrass. It's best to have a mix if you can. And sometimes you want to plant a specific thing to do a specific job, but generally a complex mix of lots of different things is better than one single species. This just emphasizes what's under the vine on the left. You've got growing plants, and you actually have an ecosystem there, and you have soil that's functioning, and you can dig down and find earthworms. And the one thing you do have is a problem of things growing up into the canopy. So you have to have a way of controlling that growth. Mechanical means is probably the best, some form of mower strimmer device, but try to do that without disturbing the soil. And the option to just blast with herbicide, some people do believe that that's fine. I don't think it's ideal. I don't think it's optimal, and it's possibly a better way to prevent weeds growing than to till. Ironically, we said tilling was really bad, and tilling is bad. Herbicide may be better than tilling, and there's certainly some in regenerative agriculture, some quite large-scale use of herbicide, much less than the conventional grower, I should say, but it's not uncommon to see herbicide used as a once-a-year job in regenerative agriculture. And there's a bit of a debate in the foundation at the moment about what's our position on herbicide, and go to our website and have a look at what we've written about it, because it's nuanced to some extent, and worth, if you're interested in this topic, it's worth getting into a bit to understand the difference and what you can achieve. So we talked about getting animals into vineyards. Now this is obviously tricky. When the vine is growing, it's quite susceptible to damage. Very tender little shoots get knocked off easily. So if your animals are at the level of or can reach the shoots, then you definitely want to keep them out of your vineyard in the early growing season, and certainly also when there's grapes around, because they can eat the grapes. So winter grazing is pretty common in lots of places, and a good thing to practice. There is a guy in the States called Kelly Mulville who has designed a vineyard that sheep can graze in all year round, and the vines are trellised quite high. It's not quite like a parallel system, but it's he also means you can go through the vineyard one way and 90 degrees to that direction by planting the vines far enough apart and having the growing wire quite high, which means he can mow and look after his vineyard without heavy equipment. He uses a quad bike, and keeping sheep in all year round when he needs to. So that's he's a very interesting guy to look at if you're interested in livestock. Ducks, geese, maybe seen in South Africa. They use them for snail control, among other things. But every animal footprint, every animal poo in a vineyard contributes something, and getting the right balance for your vineyard is a positive and will really help the life in the soil. Here is a little trying to explain why diversity is important. I talked about biodiversity being useful. So this is a concept called functional biodiversity, and this is a graph that shows that the green line is the higher level of diversity, and the red line is the losses caused by pests. And if you have a monodiverse plant species in a vineyard, nothing else growing, when you have a pest come along, it tends to go crazy because there's nothing to keep it in check. If you have a vineyard with lots of things living in it, lots of insects, lots of creatures, lots of plants of different sorts, generally speaking, most pests are controlled by one thing or another, whether it's a bird or another insect. And the more complex and diverse a system you have, the less losses you suffer. And that is definitely one of the aims of organics and biodynamics, is to have some of those creatures in your system, not to eliminate them. Don't use pesticides. Don't use insecticides, particularly, because you're actually getting rid of your valuable workers. And here's a graph that shows the population of predators and their prey. So the red is the predator. This is in terms of generations. I don't know how long a generation is in this case, but you can have, a generation every couple of weeks in some predator-prey relationships. Maybe it's a bit longer than that. Maybe it's every 6 weeks or so. But when you have a spike in the population of the predator, very quickly the population of something that controls it spikes afterwards and brings that population down again. And you can see the very first spike here is a really perhaps a catastrophic level event, but after that it just diminishes, and then perhaps for one reason or another, weather conditions, or we don't know exactly what, it spikes again, but it is controlled by the insects that live in the vineyard. Let's just move on to one of the other principles of regen, which is agroforestry, which is growing vines amid rows of trees. Here's a plot in southern France where quite large trees are being used to shade the vines, and there's multiple reasons why this is a good idea, and some reasons why it's not a good idea. So in some cases, the trees can take all the available water and starve the vines. But if you choose the right species and have them the right distance away from the vine and let them grow to the right height, they can provide valuable shading services. They can provide a habitat for birds that act as insect control. They actually also can make more water available to the vine. They've got deeper roots and they can pull water up from further down. And they also hold more water in the soil around them. So in a drought event, there's more soil around the roots of the tree, and the vine can benefit from that. So lots of people experimenting with that. This is Gerard Goby in the Roussillon, who has most of his new vineyards are now planted with 6 or 7 rows of vines and then some trees, olive trees, fruit trees. There are 1 or 2 species. I think walnuts are negative for vines because they actually put out something that prevents other things growing in the soil around them. So you do have to know your stuff, but there's plenty of people doing interesting things with trees and vines. And in the UK, you wouldn't want to shade your vines because we need all the sun we can get. But in a very hot country, you definitely might think that's a good idea to perhaps slow down your ripening, not have such high alcohols, keep some freshness and flavour in the fruit, which might be burnt out by direct sunlight. So lots of good thoughts around that. And then there's planning your entire farm on agroecological lines is not something that many vineyards have really started to do. There is the wonderful Randall Graham in the USA, who's got a project called Popoluchum. I may not have pronounced that right, but apologies if I haven't. But he has found a piece of land and planted it in a very eccentric and extraordinary way in carefully designed plots that have lots of biodiversity corridors and water resources and things in between them. And I think we'll find more vineyards thinking along these lines, where the land is wet, don't try and drain it and put a vineyard. Just let there be a pond. The land will do what it wants to do to some extent, and working with the land that's there rather than trying to, smash the existing landscape and turn it into something that it's not, is probably a good way to work. Although you might consider it's less efficient, it's certainly more beautiful and potentially more productive, particularly if you've got several different crops growing in the same place. You can actually be more productive with that land than you can with a monoculture. Sort of crazy guy in Wales called Paul Rolt, who's trying what he calls an arbustrum, which is I think an ancient Roman principle where the vine actually grows up trees, and he's planted willow trees to be the trellis. He's got 300 vines in this section of his vineyard, and it's an experiment, but there certainly are good examples of the Romans having done this in the past, and various forms of, there are a few places where they still persist. I think I went to some vineyards in Ibiza and found vines growing up trees quite commonly there. And in fact, Nan Gauda in Bolivia famously on Instagram is posting lots of pictures of people climbing trees with long ladders and harvesting grapes that grow up all in the trees. So I don't think it's going to take off as a major new way of planting vineyards, but quite an interesting thing to experiment with. I'm just checking the time. We're nearly there on the slide. So biochar is proving to be really interesting. So this is where you partially burn material. I mean, ideally your own material from your own land, but you know, particularly if you've got areas around your land that you're clearing and mulching or throwing away or incinerating. But if you make biochar instead, in the Rizio, I work a bit with Domaine Lafarge, and they've done some really interesting research on how biochar helps you hold water in your soil and how it actually can improve the yield of the vineyard really quite quickly. It's early days in their research, but there's lots of quite exciting things. My understanding of the famous soils of the Incas, they had this black soil, was it called terra preta? Which, when analysed, it became clear that it wasn't just the natural soil of the region. It had been made over hundreds of years of incorporating a lot of charred material into it. It seems that they were deliberately creating biochar, charcoal effectively, and incorporating in their soil, and it was incredibly rich, fertile soils. So that is another tool that is being explored quite a lot at the moment. Who are the kind of leaders of regen? And there are more and more people starting to use the word to apply to what they're doing. Some of whom have been doing great stuff for a long time. So people like Paul Dolan in the USA. He is, I think, one of the founders of Bonterra and Fetzer, and went on to Truett Hurst. I think he just died, unfortunately, but he was really moving from organics into biodynamics and then into regen. You have people like Tablas Creek, who we mentioned before. Jason Haas at Tablas Creek has in several ways is thinking really carefully about how he does everything, and I think is an exemplary person to follow to see what they're up to in terms of farming better. And they have animals in the vineyard, and they're using a lot of regenerative principles. I was in Australia. There's a few people out there. There's new certifications popping up. Company called Inkwell in McLaren Vale was the first to be certified in Australia. There's Alkina up in Barossa, who are doing some really interesting work. Chateau Cheval Blanc, now on the list of people claiming themselves as regenerative. Moet Hennessy's Provence Rosé, Chateau Galopé. The Jackson family business has resolved to switch 100% of its vineyards to regen by 2030. Torres in Spain has made a big move towards regen, and I think people are starting to think this is the future of farming. It's the best way to farm. We need to be thinking along these lines. So there is a big move in this direction at the moment, and I think people who perhaps won't go the whole hog and become fully certified, and a lot of certifications require you also to be organic, but there are plenty of people who can adopt regenerative practices on the way to perhaps becoming organic in the future and see an improvement. So I just want to share a couple of slides that I saw at the MW Symposium, which I thought were absolutely fascinating. This is a guy called Nacho Belda, studying soils and the microbial signature in those soils. So I don't expect anyone to completely understand or even see in detail these slides. But one of his observations was, if you look at the chart on the bottom left, there's a pattern there which is Australian soils that are radically different from everywhere else that he studied. And so he was thinking you could actually just look at the soil microbiome and predict where it came from. He says with a 90% accuracy. So that's quite interesting. We talk about terroir a lot. We think terroir is actually about the underlying bedrock in the soil, but maybe it's actually about the community of bugs that live in the soil in that area. So that's one thought. And then in terms of farming practices, this is a comparison in Spain and in the USA of conventional organic and biodynamic practitioners. And bottom left, there's a sort of spider chart that plots those groups. And you can see there are some overlaps, but also some distinct groupings, particularly in the biodynamics in Spain. There's a cluster there who are quite outliers from the other group. And then the top right, this is the pattern of the different types of species. And I have to confess, I don't completely understand this, but if you take an analysis from a conventional vineyard and it shows you a plot like the one on the left, and then you take the same thing from a biodynamic vineyard, it shows you a plot like the one on the right, it's pretty clear there's something going on that we don't really understand. And studying the microbes perhaps is revealing this in a way that we hadn't quite anticipated. So there's some fascinating work being done on getting to grips with what is happening in the soil. And I think everybody in the wine world is waking up to quite how it's much more important than we thought it was. So I'm just going to skip the last few slides, just sort of promoting the work of the RVF. We are a charity. It's a couple of years old. We have one employee. We have 8 or 9 trustees and some outside help that we're bringing in from time to time. And we're growing, and we're on a stable footing from a funding point of view. And our aim is to be the place where anyone who wants to know about regen comes first. Anyone who is in their own country looking for some resource to support them comes perhaps to our website and finds out who their neighbours might be, who they can go and talk to. So we're trying to create a network. So our vision is to work with nature to create a sustainable future for vineyards, growers and the planet. And we want to do that by inspiring the transition towards regenerative viticulture by using science, communication and grower support. So those are the things we're now working on. I would love all of you, if you would like to just join the mailing list, which just means that you'll get a monthly email and occasional invitations to things in your area if that's relevant. So please do just give us your name and address, and we try and write engaging and interesting emails about stuff that's going on in the world of regen, and I think you'll find them interesting. But also, if we're doing something particular, we'll have some initiative, we can be in touch and invite you. So we'd love that if that was of interest. We are beta testing a tool that we're calling the RV Guide, and it invites growers to come and register their vineyards and just tell us about their practices and what they're doing and what they also need help with. And that is building us a picture. And we've just entered the beta testing phase. We've got a few vineyards in there at the moment, but we're spreading our wings with a couple of sort of insider lists of vineyards or groups of producers who are friendly to our aims. So we are hoping that by the time we launch in a month or so, we'll have 100 or 200 producers in our guide. At the moment, there's a map. If you click on here, find vineyards, you can see a map, and I think it's got 25 or 30 vineyards listed there, including Tablas and some of the ones we've talked about. So quite a useful resource to see who's doing what, and it does show you a degree of what it is that they're doing. There's also a very good glossary and a toolkit explaining each of these characteristics of practices and what they mean, and each of those links through to a page of more details and with links behind to show you videos and podcasts and other resources you might want to use if you're really getting into this. So do please go and have a look at that. And that is fairly much all I had to say, and we've done, I think, quite well to finish with 10 minutes to go, which should give us plenty of time, Justin, to field any questions and have a chat about anything that perhaps wasn't well understood or needs a bit of clarification.
Absolutely. I could definitely fill more than 10 minutes with my questions. So we have had some submitted. I was just going to, one of the things I found really interesting in your presentation is that when you mentioned the producers that are farming regeneratively, and you mentioned Bonterra, Fetzer and Torres, just goes to show that, like, I mean, they're obviously quite big producers. This is not something that's kind of, artisanal and boutique. You can employ regenerative practices at any size. Would that be right?
Yes, I think you need to think about each bit of land and regard it as being different from, most people have got vineyards in several places. You can't just do the same thing everywhere and say that's going to work. You have to look at the water holding, you have to look at the organic matter, you have to look at the bedrock. There's all sorts of things you need to understand about those vineyards. But anyone who is sensitive to that and has a viticulture that's respectful to the particular place they're growing, I think, who understands the principles and what they're trying to achieve, can definitely apply regen across a large scale. It's relatively new as a concept. I know that the Torres guys have implemented quite a lot. I think they're up to 500 hectares of their 1,200 hectares in total. I also know it's been incredibly dry in Catalonia for the last 2 years, and that makes it a major problem to have living roots in your soil and photosynthesizing plants in the summer, because they just don't grow because there isn't any water. So I think they've had a lot of trials where they planted things and they haven't thrived. So, there's a learning journey, and there's actually one of the founding originators of the regen movement is a guy called Gabe Brown in the USA, who's a I think Trump supporting redneck farmer who he had such a run of bad luck. He had 4 years of incredibly bad luck, and he had no money at all. And he just worked out. He saved his own seed. He couldn't go and buy seed from people, so he kept up part of his crop to grow a seed to seed the next year. And he learned so much from having no money that you can do stuff for free. And he's now absolutely, he's just on the speaker circuit. He's spends more of his time talking and persuading other people to get into regen than he earns from his farm. But his farm is also much more profitable than it was. So it takes a while to get it going. You have to create a system that's working, but the dividends will pay off in the future.
Yeah, thank you. Two questions. Oh, actually, I've just scanned read the second one so I've got two questions from Delaney. The second one is kind of similar to what I asked earlier, actually. The first one is a pleasing can of worms to throw at you here, Justin. So I'm going to read this out because members can't see the Q&As at home. So she says, considering there's a clear proliferation of sustainability standards, how does the regenerative framework position itself? So is it going to unify or bridge existing standards, or does it stand alone as a distinct approach? And she says potentially there's some confusion for producers and consumers. So I guess it's a question about certification, isn't it, and what your sort of stance on that is.
Yeah. I mean, that is a interesting topic. I don't know if you're following the work of the Sustainable Wine Roundtable, who are attempting.
I believe Delaney may actually work for them.
may work for them. Okay. Well, you're probably deep in the weeds on this one, and you will know that it's tough trying to compare like for like in different countries with different ways of measuring and different units of measurement. And what is essentially, I think that the trouble with sustainability as a concept is all of the certifications of sustainability are inviting you in with a relatively low bar, where you don't have to do a lot to get certified, so that most people can come in. And this is definitely what's explained to me in New Zealand. And I definitely get that. I think that's a great way to approach it, because if you say you can only be sustainable if you're in the top 10% and everyone else, you can't play, it's not going to be helpful. Whereas if you get everyone in the tent and then you gradually raise the bar for people, I think that's a much better approach. The problem is with the word sustainable, because you're kind of giving the indication that you're now sustainable. And the trouble is we're just not sustainable. This kind of way of farming isn't sustainable into the future. So I think enrolled in a sustainability program working towards sustainability is what is actually happening. And I suppose we approach things from a slightly different angle, and we're not trying to be a certification. The foundation itself is very much got a clear policy of being certification neutral. We believe certifications have a good influence, and there will be certifications, and we don't want to undermine them or disagree with them. They exist, and they will drive positive change for many people. But I think they can also drive negative change. And one of the very interesting conversations I had at Groundswell, there was a session on the certification of regen. And one of the people speaking there was Helen Browning or Helen Brown, I can't remember, the CEO of the Soil Association. And she said, it took the Soil Association about 40 years from developing the concept of organic to actually saying, well, what should be in a certification? And she was really excited. And she feels, I think she admitted, she feels a bit constrained by the certification that was done in the 60s or 70s. That was what was enshrined as organic, because that actually now is a bit out of date, and there's some things they would change if they did it again. And she said she sees this incredible energy, incredible innovation and diversity in the regen movement, and application of tech and use of robots for weeding. Whereas if you can electrocute only the species you don't like, rather than putting weed killer everywhere, suddenly you've got an incredibly better result with the use of tech. That may well turn out to be a better result. So being able to allow innovation and not to certify too early was her recommendation for regen. So we're definitely just advocating for learning about it, advocating for starting practicing and seeing what happens, and then getting together in groups and finding out in your area what works and sharing that knowledge and moving as quickly as possible in a good direction. And if that leads you to certification, I think we're delighted. And I think the sustainability debate will gradually move on. There will be a bit more of unification between different countries as to what they mean. And there probably will be a global standard for sustainability at some point. It is important that we don't tell people that's it. Once you tick the green box, you've done all you need to do, because it definitely isn't. There's a lot more to be done.
Thank you. I'm not sure we're going to get through all of these questions, Justin, because it's been an absolute torrent. But I'll put some more to you. So somebody's asked, most if not all of your examples are a bottom-up initiation at vineyard level for regenerative viticulture. So are there what support is there? Are there any countries, regulated bodies that are providing leadership, or is there any bursaries or financial resources or anything available to growers?
A good question. So one of the things the RVF has just done and has not yet published is a literature review, which is a full review of all the academic studies that have been done, of which there are quite a lot, and it's been quite tricky to encompass what actually is regen, and is this paper really is it part of regen or is it not? So a lot of work has been done, and there's some really interesting stuff that's been pulled together. So that will be available in a month or two, I think, when we publish the lit review. I think secondly, there's a surprisingly large amount of money sloshing around the USA and the European Union, looking to find ways of changing agriculture quickly. And you kind of do have to come up with a carbon argument, or some measurable, easily scalable improvement to get the big money. But I think people who are doing that, who are coming up with a novel gadget or a novel way of analyzing or a novel way of proving something, and can actually show the scalability of this, there's plenty of investors. So I think there is funding available, and there are grants available. Belinda Kemp at NIAB in the UK is very well connected in the academic world, and she knows which grants are available for research, and she's busy applying for as many of them as she can. And likewise in other countries. And I know in France a few people who are kind of astonished at the amount of money that's spoken about as being available to do projects to get cooperative growers, for instance, in France, to switch practices and prove a positive result. So, yeah, I think it's a developing picture, and I think it's one that we see as part of our role of communicating around this, to try and help people see that there's opportunities. But we can't do everything at once, and we're not very sophisticated in our knowledge at the moment.
And presumably it's to the huge strength of regenerative viticulture that it's happening amongst this wider movement in regenerative agriculture that's able to make that sort of noise and get your Netflix documentaries and things that you mentioned. It must be hugely beneficial.
I think it is. And look, there's some big name businesses, including some people you might consider on the bad side of the fence. But the fact that they've made this bet is a really telling one. So people like McDonald's and McCain, and we've seen McCain advertising on telly, Nestle, lots of them have actually thought, we don't think that necessarily certifying organic is the right thing for our land, but we do want to make a difference. So actually what seems to be the biggest impact, the biggest difference we can make, is to persuade our growers of potatoes for McCain or beef for McDonald's or whatever it is to switch to regenerative practices, because they are proving at scale, particularly in the USA, to actually be much more positive for the environment, and actually positive economically for the farmers doing it. So they're not getting lower yields and less money, they're getting more money and as good yields by switching. So that is giving the whole movement a scale and an exposure that is perhaps helping its transition in viticulture.
And that's the real crux of regeneratives, isn't it? I mean, it makes sense from a sort of ethical point of view, but it actually makes sense from an economic point of view as well. I mean, you wouldn't be asking producers just to do this out of the goodness of their heart, but they actually see positive increases in yields and quality of their crop as well.
Yes, but that's not really yet proven in wine. I'm not saying it's not likely to be proven, but it depends on what topic it is and which area of the country it is, and there's lots of good examples. There's a really interesting guy. I mean, if you're interested in this, there's a guy called John Kempf who has a podcast called the Regenerative Agriculture Podcast, I think, and he is just absolutely full of examples of, I went to see a farmer, he said, I have this problem, I told him to do this, that, and the other, and 10 years later he was 4 times more profitable. He said that it hasn't been a farm yet that I've been to that I haven't been able to make more profitable as a result of implementing regenerative practices. And that doesn't always mean bigger yields, but it means more profit because you're spending much less money on inputs. And in agriculture, the amount of money they're spending on inputs fertilizer and chemicals treatments, those are getting so much more expensive with the oil price that, you know, when the cost of the inputs rises to negate the entire profit you're making, it's kind of a wasted exercise. And that is the picture for a lot of farmers out there. They've got bigger and bigger and bigger, and they now can't go anywhere, and they're actually losing money just standing still. So that's not quite the same in wine, but I think the good case histories will emerge of people who do make more money as a result of switching to regen.
Fantastic. Well, listen, Justin, we've got more questions, but I'm afraid we're just not going to have time to go through them all. But if members particularly want anything answering, perhaps they could send it to an email, and then I could get in touch with either Justin or somebody from the RVF, and they might be able to get back to you. Is that possible, Justin?
Yes, we'd be very happy to try and do that. So please do send the questions in, and I will forward them on to Becky, who's our full-time, 4-day-a-week employee, and she will do her best to get back if we can find an answer.
And there's just one final question for Irina, who was asking whether or not it's okay to refer people to Becky's 3 recent UK wine show podcasts. But I imagine you probably got all these resources up on the RVF site. So should we direct people there to listen to that one and a whole load of other resources?
Becky will tell you if she's managed to put it up yet. There is a podcast section on the site, and I think they should be there. But obviously it's maintained by one person, and therefore there's quite a few things to add on, so it's not always completely up to date. But yeah, please do direct people to the website, and there should be plenty of information there, and Becky's contact details should be also there if you've got a question directly for her.
Fantastic. Well, Justin, that's all we've got time for, but thank you so much for this genuinely absolutely fascinating introduction to the topic. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of it, but a hugely important topic, and one that you could probably spend the rest of your life studying. So thank you for your time, and thank you for joining us. Members, thank you for joining us wherever you're dialing in from, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next one. So bye bye for now.
Lovely. Thanks very much, everyone.